Welcome back to Old War Stories with Uncle Jay. This one is entitled Waving Goodbye. This dates back to when I was a really young kid. By the way, I'm sitting by the tree again here because none of you all told me whether or not you think this is a good spot, simply because the video where I asked you that hasn't been released yet. So I think it's a nice little spot that we can, change things up every now and again. Anyway, this is dating back to when I was a little kid, 5, 6 years old. We'll say a good 6 years old, so this will bring us around 1985 or so. That sounds like a fair bet. And this went on from that time until probably a good 5, 6, 7 years. I don't really remember exactly. Anyways, the way it worked was back when I was a kid, my father used to work what was called second shift. Second shift was from 5 p.m. till 1 a.m., something like that. And then they had third shift, which would work 1 a.m. till 9 a.m., and then the 9 to 5 guys kind of thing. That's how it works. So he worked second shift. So when he would get home, he would get off work at 1 in the morning, and he'd get home by about 2, watch TV for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it was. And that'll take us to about 4 a.m., at which point he'd go to bed. And then he had to sleep until the next day when he'd have to go back to work. So he'd get up around 3-ish, somewhere in there probably. And you have your morning routine. Well, that was his morning routine in the afternoon. Well, anyway, my mother was still functional. There's a cardinal that went by and a loud plane. My mother was still functional at the time and always ensured that we had dinner on the table. Dinner was served at 4 o'clock, pretty much no ifs, ands, or buts. It was just that simple. We ate early because my dad had to go to work. Whether it was leftovers that were reheated or a meal she just cooked that day, it was on the table, heated up, ready to eat, ready to go. So we'd eat at 4, and then he'd do a couple other little whatever he had to do before he goes to work, and then around 5 o'clock he'd leave. Or even 4:30 he'd leave, something like that. He'd be there on time. It was not the kind of thing where you had to punch a clock kind of thing, so he could stroll in kind of when he wanted. Not too late, but Anyways, the problem was that would leave my mother to watch my sister and I when we were kids. Now, I did not take a very good liking to my mother because she was a pain in the ass, selfish, and at times abusive. I was beaten as a kid. I make no bones about it. Was that the right thing to do? No, certainly not. But giving a kid a timeout like we have these days teaches them absolutely nothing. So that's not the right answer either. And no, I don't have the right answer. But anyway, that was that. So I would go out. So therefore, my father was the favored parent as far as I was concerned. So I would go out when my dad would go to work, and he'd get in his, I think it was a 78 Dodge Aspen with a Slant Six engine, and I'd wait for him to start it up. And it had a very unique sound starting, as many of the Chrysler products at that time did, because they used a gear reduction starter. And it was this whiny sounding starter in that, and it was a bit cold-blooded in that, but he'd get it running every day. And it took him into the city every day, worked in Manhattan. And I remember he'd start the car up, and then, you leave it run for 30 seconds, a minute, whatever it is, and then he'd go on his way. So I'd be standing there on the sidewalk, and his car is parked right there on the street, and then he'd put the car in drive. before I get into this, the whiff was mentioning some things, and this triggered in my mind recently, and I almost cried. My father is alive and well. He's doing just fine. I haven't told him this, but I'm sure he'd probably remember. And he's not exactly old, but he did just inform me that he found a final resting place and all that kind of great stuff. So he knows that the years are winding down. He's about 70, 71, something like that. So he's got time yet, but things are starting to wind down. Anyways, it scares me a bit. But anyway, I almost cried over this because I remembered it, and it was almost like, let me spend as much time as I can with my dad, because I know as soon as I go home, I got my mother to deal with. Not something I wanted. So he'd put the car in drive, and he'd start pretty much like idling the car down the block. Now there were 2 more houses till the stop sign, so he'd sort of idle, and on the sidewalk, I'd start waving goodbye to him, and I'd run down the block to the stop sign, waving the whole time. And then, as I was younger like that, I would stand there at the corner, because I really shouldn't be crossing the street at 5 years old alone, 6 years old alone, kind of thing. So I'd stand there and I'd wave goodbye, and I'd watch till he gets to the next corner where he'd make a right, and you could see him wave, through the back window. And it was just this cute thing I did as a kid. And man, that memory just, I almost went into tears over that, because I had completely forgotten about that. Because again, I knew that as soon as the car was gone, I had to turn back and walk back home. And then I got my mother to deal with. Now, most times it wasn't a problem. This was not an everyday thing or any of that. But it just, my dad was the favored parent, and really, in my opinion, still is today. My mother always said that I don't have a favorite between you and your sister. I'll believe it. I'll buy that. We were both treated equally like shit. So it is what it is. Anyway, that was kind of it with that. But there was one other thing I used to remember as a kid, which sort of shaped and or molded me into an adult in sort. What I mean by that is, I remember walking home from school. Now, to get to school was too easy. You go down to that same corner with the stop sign, you make a right, and you go all the way until you're sitting in your classroom, because it was just at the end of that road, about 3 blocks down. It was the simplest thing. There were no crazy turns or streets or anything like that, and I had to cross a dead end, which there was never any traffic on, a road which there might be a car every now and again, and another road which there almost never was a car in. They've since closed that exit of the school, the elementary school I used to go to. I don't know why. But anyways, I'd walk home from school. So here we are. It's April now. It's almost 60 degrees out. It's a nice day. I'm sitting out here. And this didn't matter what the weather was, but I just remember a lot of times being in this kind of weather, and I'd go down back to my block and make a left, and if I saw my dad's Dodge Aspen with the hood open and or jacked up, and sometimes the trunk open at the same time, I knew it was going to be a good night. Because when I'd get home from school, I'd run in quick, drop my book bag, and come back out and watch Daddy work on the car. Now, he never let me work on the car, but he had me watch, and he had me hand him tools. So I learned early on what tools were what and what they were used for, and I watched how he used them. So there was that. But he never let me, like, even putting lug nuts back on. And I know that as a little boy, I wouldn't be strong enough to tighten it down and that, but, it's like, let me spin them on that. No, your hands will get dirty. No, this and that. No, no, no. Well, let me turn that bolt. No, 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 no. So he never gave me the hands-on experience, and I sort of resent that a bit. But I also understand that he didn't want his ride fucked up. Okay? Nowadays, things are a lot different because I'm a grown adult, and if we were to work on a car together, he hands me the wrench and lets me do the work. Okay, now I'm not a mechanic. I don't even play one on YouTube or anything like that. Sometimes I do. I know which end of the screwdriver to hold. I know which way to turn a wrench. That's about the extent of it. I have the mechanical sense. How do you say this? When you tighten down a bolt, this is something that you can't teach anyone. It's just from experience. And what I mean by that is when you tighten a bolt down, you get it tight to a point where you're like, okay, that's about right, and then just that little more. You just get a feel for how tight the bolt is. So I never had that, and I had to develop that later on in life. And that's kind of really what the problem was, is that I wish I could have developed that earlier on. But it is what it is. It's a great ability, and you need that when you're going to work on stuff, whether it's screws or nuts and bolts or what have you, just to learn that. And every once in a great while, if there's something that's like not critical, whether it was on the house or in the car or whatever, he'd let me tighten the bolt down. And then he'd say, okay, let me see. And then he'd get on that and say, no, it needed to be a bit tighter. And then I kind of learned, okay, let me make it, no, that's too tight. Okay, and then, you kind of learn from that, but you get a feel for that is something you can't teach someone. They just have to experience it, really. So that was kind of an interesting one. And while we're on the subject of the old Dodge Aspen and that, there were just a very few handful of times that I remember we would get to that same stop sign coming back from somewhere, and my dad says, you want to pull into the driveway? I was, again, a little kid, okay? So it was a bench seat in front, and I said, yeah. And I jump over the bench seat in the front, and I think I would stand on the seat because that would make me tall enough to grab the steering wheel. And it was all kind of a joke because, my dad was holding the wheel underneath, so in case anything. But we were only going like 2-3 houses anyways. But I remember that, and I would go to like turn the wheel, and Daddy's actually turning it for me underneath. And we pull into the driveway and that. So I just remember like these little things as I was a kid with that. They were a lot of fun to reflect back on. And the nice part is that those are the kind of memories that you're going to have with any loved one when they pass. That memory can never, ever, ever be erased. I will always remember all of that stuff, and it is absolutely ineffable. And that's what you remember people by after they're gone. And it's a shame they're gone, and you wish you could pick up the phone and talk to them, or even go see them. But we're all just for a short spin on this little blue marble. And when your time's up, it's up, and that's that. So I know that again, my dad's going to be around for some time to come, but things are starting to wind down. But we got time yet. Hopefully a nice long time, but we'll see how it goes. Anyway, that's going to wrap up this episode of Old War Stories with Uncle Jay. I thank you so much for watching, and I really appreciate it. Make sure you click like, make sure you click subscribe, click on the plane, and take care. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.